Hello, my name's Cliff Freilich. I'm the executive director of Cinema St. Louis, and we're the presenters of the 29th annual Whitaker St. Louis International Film Festival. We're really pleased to have as one of our films, Hamtramck USA, which presumably you have just watched, and you're now tuning in to hear a conversation with the co-directors, Justin Feltman and Razi Jafri. Really pleased to have both of you with us. Say hi.
Hey guys, thanks for
Hi, everyone.
So anyway, let's get started with the basics. Now, I know, Razi, I've just been informed that you live in Hamtramck, at least currently. I don't know, were you in Hamtramck when you decided? I see a kitty has joined us. That's always nice.
Yeah, he just came back into the house, so he's pretty happy to see me right now. Yeah, I live in Hamtramck. I decided to move there after the filming was done. So I moved here in May of 2018. I mean, I kind of fell in love with Hamtramck. I knew a little bit about it, obviously before we started working on the project, but felt like the right place to be for me. So, yeah.
All right. So you've relocated there, but you weren't originally from there. So I'm curious, and this is an easy question. How did you guys stumble across this story, and why did you decide that this is a film? So whoever wants to start.
Razi, you want to kind of start that, and I'll jump in.
Yeah. So in the summer of 2016, I'd met Justin. He was working on a documentary about marginalized voices during the 2016 presidential election, and so he was coming to Michigan. So Justin's from DC. He was coming to Michigan to kind of interview people, and I was helping him identify community leaders or interesting people to talk to for that project. And through the course of working together, on that, we, talked about working on a project together ourselves. And we kind of landed on the topic of Hamtramck because it's America's first Muslim majority city. It's an immigrant majority city. It sort of embodies a lot of the storylines of the 2016 presidential elections. So we decided, hey, we were going to work on this film. And then, of course, about a month later, Trump got elected. So it became all the more important to tell the story. So we were thinking about, we've got our kind of subject now. How do we, tell this story? How do we anchor it? And so we were thinking about, if there's some major event that's happening, some controversy, something that could anchor the story. So we looked it up and we found out that there was going to be an election in 2017, which gave us a perfect kind of storyline to, focus on Hamtramck. And so that's what it was. And Justin ended up going back to DC. He left all of his equipment with me here in Detroit. And then I started filming, and then he would come back, and eventually ended up moving to Hamtramck for 6 months production. And that's kind of the basic story of how we got started.
And you were originally in Detroit then, proper, as opposed to in
I'm from Michigan. I was born in India. My family migrated to Detroit, so I grew up in Metro Detroit, and I was living in Detroit, at the time. And just for the benefit of the audience, to give you an idea of the geography, Hamtramck is located inside of Detroit. I know it's mentioned in the film, but it's worth mentioning again. It's Detroit has two cities inside of its boundaries, Hamtramck and Highland Park. So yeah, I just wanted to give some context there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So Justin, talk a little bit about the experiences of winning the trust of the people that you were going to be filming. Obviously, documentarians have to go in sort of cold. You didn't have pre-existing relationships, and you need those relationships in order to have a film that's compelling. You obviously have an election, so people are more prone on some levels to talk to you, but not necessarily in an honest and unguarded way. They want to present what they want to present to the public. So what was the process of sort of winning over all the various people that you followed? And then we'll also talk about how you winnowed down who specifically you were going to focus on.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think for us, a big thing was to, when we first meet with people, leave the cameras, really kind of get to know them and invest in them. As we kind of showcase in the film, there's been a lot of media coverage of this small little town. People from, France and, the BBC and Germany come with quite regular frequency, but they come for like a day or two, they get their story and they leave. And Razi and I kind of knew that if we really wanted to get a new perspective, that we needed to invest in the city and invest in the people's stories for longer periods of time. So we really did try to, at least early on, kind of leave the cameras, get to know them, kind of ask about them, and beyond just the kind of sensational coverage that we had been seeing out of the city, is like, what is your concerns? What is, what worries you about Hamtramck? What, keeps you invested in this city? What makes you the best candidate? Really kind of understanding them by just, really investing in them. And I think that's how a lot of people really welcomed us in, is that it's a very friendly and warm city. I think they just had a little bit of media burnout for a little bit there. And so I think, that was really the key. And, I don't know if you want me to answer the other question about.
Sure, feel free.
We whittled down our options is, early on, especially, we kind of followed as many of people. We left the city council side a little bit, because there was, I think, 12 candidates or 11 candidates for city council. So we're like, all right, let's wait on that one a little bit until after the primary, just to see who kind of washes out a little bit. The mayoral election, we really were thinking Kamal seemed to have a, good grassroots base going, and Karen, of course, was gonna, make it through the primary as well. So we kind of knew who those characters would be. Kamal didn't make it through the primary, and that kind of, what was a little bit of a, all right, what do we do now kind of moment. But, we kept him in the film because he still, even as not a candidate, still wanted to play his part and still wanting to, care about the city and guide kind of democracy in the city a bit as well. With Fadl, I mean, I think kind of right away when we met Fadl, he's one of those guys that is just can't help but be honest about how he feels. And so, he's just one of those characters. As soon as you meet him, you're like, oh yeah, this is our guy. So the only question with him was whether he'd make it through the primary, and he snuck in. And so we knew he was a main character from the beginning.
Now, you obviously did have a surprise, as you note, that one of the people that you were following disappeared. And then the person who did emerge as the other candidate wasn't as forthcoming with you. Was that a frustration initially? And how did you decide to work around it? Either one of you can answer that question.
Yeah, it was definitely difficult. I mean, he being one of the two, candidates in the general election, it's like, that's a big part of the story, and he did do a sit-down interview with us, and so, but, as you know, from watching the film, we didn't really use a lot of the interviews in the film itself. Yeah, I mean, it was definitely tricky kind of trying to work around it. And then, you sort of start thinking about what's the overall story that you're trying to tell, and how does he fit into it as one of the pieces of this whole kind of moving, machinery. But yeah, it's definitely kind of challenging. There were, other characters that played a role, in Hamtramck politics, whose voices we were able to lift a little bit more. Like people like Abraham Ayash, the young activist in the film, who's now gone on to become the state rep for the district that Hamtramck's in for the state of Michigan. Yeah, I mean, we just tried to identify other people and try to tell like the bigger story about Hamtramck.
Well, it's the nature of documentary filmmaking, obviously, that you have to be prepared for the unexpected and adapt accordingly. But that was obviously a surprise, I'm sure, to you, since it seemed almost a slam dunk on some levels that the character that you were following, and who was much more open with you, would emerge as one of the candidates in the out of the primary. So that was a surprise also to the viewers. So it became actually an interesting part of the film.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that was one of those things that I think the night of the results coming out, where we really had to think about, like, what do we do? Do we now make this Karen film? But I think also I would say that Muhammad Hassan did warm up to us over time. As Razi mentioned, I think it was about a week before the general election, he actually did do a sit-down interview with us. You know, I would still say it was never like the access we got with Kamal, but he did, you know, over time, I think we built that trust with him. And I think he was one of those guys that was a little, you know, averse to kind of media attention because he didn't want to participate in certain narratives that were sensationalized around the city. And I think over time he kind of, you know, invited us. Like for instance, that event where Fadl says, you know, he sees him and they're in like this building, and he's kind of saying how, you know, it wasn't personal, it's politics. And then he's like, oh, I can't believe I just said that. That was actually a Muhammad Hassan fundraiser that he invited us to. So, you know, over time he did warm up to us and give us a little better access.
Before you joined us, Razi, I was telling Justin that this film is part of a program that we do every year in conjunction with Washington University's Center for the Humanities called The Divided City. And it mostly focuses on divisions that are along racial lines within cities. But I thought that Hamtramck USA was great from the point of view of showing, you know, racial, not racial divides, but ethnic, religious divides, but it's a much more hopeful film than what we're used to seeing from our Divided City entries typically, which do not show people necessarily getting along, and it is much more conflict oriented as opposed to cooperation based. Hamtramck really does seem, and not that, you know, again, I was saying, nobody wants to lose their political power, or nobody's happy about giving up an electoral position, and yet there does seem to be much more of a spirit of community, and we're in this together. We need to work collectively to move forward in Hamtramck than what you see in a lot of communities. What do you think accounts for that? And is that a correct perception, or do you think there's more divisions than perhaps I'm perceiving?
Yeah, it's mostly, I'd say, a correct perception. I think there's a couple things that Hamtramck has going for it. You know, one is its long history of welcoming immigrants. You know, starting as French, you know, kind of a colony, then having German immigrants, then over time, you know, for most of its history, becoming a majority Polish city. And then, you know, over the last 30 years, having had an influx of, you know, people from, you know, Bangladesh, Yemen. There was a large, you know, group of people that came here as refugees and asylum seekers from the Balkans during the breakup of Yugoslavia. So there has been always this kind of, you know, legacy of resettlement, you know, accepting asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants into Hamtramck. That's probably one thing, you know, one big thing that Hamtramck has going for itself. And then I think it's also kind of just like the city's infrastructure and the way that it's laid out is, you know, the homes are very close to each other. It's very urban. So much of the interactions and collisions, the social interactions and social collisions take place in the streets. At the grocery stores, and so people have no choice but to shop at, you know, the other person's, you know, grocery store, especially now. And you know, recently there was an initiative. I think it's called Freedom House or something like that. But there was a development that was built that I think it was built to house like 15 refugee families from the Central African, you know, Central African Republic, and so this type of resettlement has always happen. Now, on the other side, you know, Hamtramck has certainly had its stumbles along the way. There is a history of racial profiling, you know, with police. There's redlining issues as well, and the scars of some of these issues are still being dealt with today. But for the most part, I think, you know, there's a lot that can be learned from Hamtramck's experiences, as it's kind of sometimes stumbled along the way. But it does both through, you know, the city itself, and then through the film that we've tried to present publicly, is that presents a type of a hope for the future as well. Because, you know, in the United States, we have to come to terms with the reality that our nation is changing very, very quickly in terms of demographics. and in terms of culture too. But Hamtramck is in many ways very unique, but in other ways it's not. You have many cities across the United States which are, quote unquote, minority majority cities, and so we are all going to have to basically figure out how do we make multiculturalism work. Hamtramck's not perfect, but it does kind of make it work in its own unique way. So that all being said, I think there's a lot of value in Hamtramck's story, and certainly our hope is to use the film as a starting point to answer or to speak to a lot of the questions that you've just asked as well.
Now, one aspect, obviously, that you don't really deal with much, if at all, in the film, I can't recall, is the fact, obviously it's surrounded by Detroit, which is a majority Black population. And Hamtramck, Justin was saying, hovers around 15% African-American. And I assume one of the reasons why that's the case is perhaps those redlining issues that you referenced, and that perhaps Hamtramck was to some degree a white refuge at one point, perhaps, that was actually purposely keeping African Americans out. So that history obviously could have been, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you did deal with it. It's been several months since I last saw it, but were you tempted at all to sort of fold that into the mix?
Yeah, I mean, I think early on, especially.
Yeah, I think,
we've discussed how, I mean, there's Hamtramck's have got a very fascinating history, and it's hard to kind of put everything we wanted to put in the film. I mean, we can make about 10 short films that we'd really want to do. And yeah, there was a, I want to say it was in the 50s or 60s when they were building the highway system. There was a lawsuit that, they're still dealing with today that said that, the city and Detroit as a whole had purposely targeted Black neighborhoods for the construction of the highway system, which, I think most cities in the United States have a lawsuit somewhat similar to this, where they purposely constructed the infrastructure to destroy Black neighborhoods. And yeah, so I mean, Hamtramck is not immune to those kinds of things throughout its history as well.
So at this point in Hamtramck's current moment, do you see that there has been a sort of balance struck, that power is being shared reasonably well? Obviously, the polls are beginning to suffer electoral defeat. They kept the power in their hands for quite some time, obviously, and they're slowly being, I guess, pushed out. Not entirely, but to certainly from a mayoral point of view, that just occurred. How are they reacting to those changes, the Polish community in Hamtramck?
I mean, Razi, if you want to add in on this, a lot of the Polish community has kind of aged out or moved out. So, I think there's the Polish community as of today is kind of elderly in large part. And a lot of the kids of the Polish community moved out to the suburbs like Warren and Sterling Heights, and they come back in and they may voice their opinions on things. But, I mean, I don't want to be rude, but they don't have a skin in the game anymore. So, it's no longer their city just because there's a legacy or your warm childhood memories. When you left, it's no longer your democracy to take on. And I think that, Razi, what were you going to say there?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, sometimes we'll hear these comments when we talk about the film, or I'll mention that I live in Hamtramck. People will say, you'll learn how many people, whose families used to live in Hamtramck have now moved out, as Justin was saying. We'll say things like, oh, Hamtramck used to be so nice. And then it just, and it's a type of veiled, racialized comment about who lives there now. But one thing that's kind of happening there is there's a type of memory vacuum, that the reason that Hamtramck went into decline is because of capitalism, and white flight, and also and Polish flight, from the city. And so when these factories, are closing, it's going to have an economic impact, and a social impact on the city. And so that's really when the city went into decline in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. When the Bangladeshi and Yemeni communities started moving in, they were buying up the homes and the vacant foreclosed storefronts and properties and repurposing these buildings and moving their families into these homes, and really have saved the city. And so that's, I think, kind of a source of tension, but it comes from like a collective sort of, lack of knowledge about what actually happened here, and why the city is the way that it is today. I mean, if it wasn't for the immigrant, communities that moved in, and by the way, many of these people didn't just move here from abroad. There's a lot of people that moved to Hamtramck from places like Astoria, Jackson Heights, in Queens, because it was just a lot easier to buy a house here and have property, start a business, and that's what a lot of people did. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect, and like Justin's saying, it's like, a lot of the commentary that we get from, the Polish people that left, it's like, yeah, they don't really have a connection to Hamtramck anymore, but they certainly have a lot of opinions about it. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case with a lot of folks who exit a community but still feel invested in it, even though they don't literally invest in the community any longer.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And nostalgia kind of takes over, and it, it's unfair to really entertain their nostalgia more than you entertain the local residents that currently invest in the city.
Now, given the fact that Hamtramck is essentially embedded within Detroit and its status as a Muslim majority city, has that caused any tension within the Detroit metro area? Obviously, the Muslim population in the U.S., because of the current political climate, has been demonized and made to feel unwelcome in a lot of different places. Within Hamtramck, obviously, because it's Muslim majority, I would presume that they feel welcome there. But what about in the larger Detroit area?
Yeah, I mean, I would say Metro Detroit is fairly multicultural. There's a huge population of Muslims, Jews. It's fairly diverse. However, like many and most metropolitan areas in America, it's highly segregated also. So communities tend to sort of congregate close to one another and live in hubs, basically. But because there's such a large population here, I think through, just even through things like food and culture and music, people are exposed to each other's cultures. And so you have a level of understanding here that you might not have in a place that's, maybe more rural or less multicultural. And so we have Muslims that now represent us in the US, House of Representatives. We had a Muslim candidate that ran for governor for the state of Michigan. He lost in the primary, but it was a highly visible campaign. And so when you have this type of visibility, it does help to build bridges between communities. And there's all these studies that show that the perceptions on the LGBTQ communities, or any community, changes drastically when somebody meets somebody or gets to know somebody from that community. It's like the difference is night and day. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing here in Metro Detroit and in other places that, have large multicultural and diverse populations. You see, people able to, enjoy the benefits of multiculturalism. Sometimes just simply through, cultural experiences of food, music, things like that. But yeah, I mean, I'd say in Metro Detroit, it's pretty comfortable, being Muslim in this area. Yeah, I mean, once you go outside of the region or the area, then it becomes, a little bit trickier. But on a whole, I mean, I think right now we're in this sort of tumultuous political landscape, but people will generally kind of just leave you alone, and respect your boundaries and things like that, but it's just like, it's this, we're in this time right now where this high degree of tension, in society, and in a post 9/11 and a post Trump era. Well, not post-Trump yet, but we're in a Trump era right now where he's certainly lifted, and given permission to a lot of the, racialized tensions that have existed in our country for many, many decades, throughout the history of our country. And so that's really lifted out a lot of Islamophobia. So we've seen a huge uptick in Islamophobic hate crimes. Actually, the uptick was much more than we saw after 9/11. So, what I'd say is like, both on a micro level, kind of locally in Metro Detroit and on a national level, I think both things are true. I mean, we're seeing really wonderful representation of American Muslims. Mahershala Ali was the first American Muslim to win an Oscar. Rami won a Golden Globe for his program, on Hulu. So, and we have representation in government and politics and sports and things like that. So, on one side, there's this really amazing platform that Muslims are now starting to develop, culturally, socially, politically. But at the same time, you do have this problem of Islamophobia, and the population having a negative perception of Muslims. Over time, hopefully, that's something that we can overcome through education, through media, through accurate and nuanced portrayals of American Muslims. And so I know I kind of, took your question a little bit further, but it's tied to kind of more national conversations too about race, religion, Islamophobia, so on and so forth.
No, I'm glad you did exactly that. And I think Hamtramck USA is an example of introducing people to a different view of Islam and the people who practice it, and their integration into U.S. politics and the U.S., as well as still maintaining their own identities. That we don't need total assimilation, that people can actually still respect their own traditions and still be productive and welcome citizens of the U.S. We need more kinds of representations of that, and I hope people see Hamtramck USA and perhaps gain some insight along those lines.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
We appreciate.
Well, go ahead.
I was going to say I appreciate the Sufjan's film. Immigrant at Home is another good example of that. Another kind of adding the layer.
Yeah, absolutely.
We reached out to him and, got to see that film, and I, couldn't have picked a better pairing.
Well, good. That's what we try to do. We don't always succeed, but yeah, we like to have complementary films that don't necessarily duplicate one another exactly, but that ramify.
Yeah, certainly a good compliment.
Well, great. Thanks again for you two taking the time. Is there anything else that you thought should be explored before we exit?
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of some parting thoughts. I think, we're living in strange and interesting times and dynamic times, and it can feel overwhelming and very negative at times, but you do have these really beautiful stories in America all across the country. And we believe that this humble city and this film that we've made about it can highlight some of that positivity, and because it does have a hopeful ending, and we hope to start conversations through the film around multiculturalism and how can we create a better, more peaceful, more verdant future, for our country, because I think that's what everybody wants. And to that effect, we're in the middle of developing an educational curriculum right now where we'd love to work with schools and universities, libraries, churches, community organizations to bring the film to those organizations. And so if anybody's interested in that, they can certainly reach out to us, contact us through social media. And we'd love to bring the film to you and hopefully have a productive discussion around some of these issues.
And I wish we were able to have that productive discussion in person here at the film festival.
Of course, yeah, same.
Sadly, that's not to be this year. But one of the nice aspects of the pandemic, such as they are, is our ability to reach out, obviously, to filmmakers and give them an opportunity to chat through me with the people who just experienced their film. So at least we have an opportunity to bring you more directly to them.
Yeah, thank you. We hope to visit in person someday, and thank you for all the good work that you're doing. It's a wonderful film festival, and hopefully we get to be a part of it in the future.
All right, great. Well, we'll look for more work in the future. Thanks again, and best of luck as you move forward with Hamtramck USA and get it out to the maximum audience possible.